Well, good evening, everyone. I apologize in advance for all the throat clearing, but if any of you suffer from the pollen that's in the air like I do, you will have complete sympathy. And it's come on us hard and fast, hasn't it? Just like the heat, all showed up at once. Now that pine pollen's been in the air for a while, but it's got a lot of new friends out there suddenly here recently. We're going to continue our study of the book of Daniel. We are in chapter 5. We left off, we had completed verse 12. I warned Michael, this could go a lot of ways tonight. If I wander off my notes, we could be here really late. My goal is to finish chapter 5 tonight because it's a really good break point. Chapter 6 begins a whole new phase of Daniel's life, so we can leave off after chapter 5 and pick up with chapter 6 in the fall, and we don't really have to go back and relearn everything. But if I leave off and leave a couple of verses of chapter 5 to go, that's just going to be a tough thing to go pick back up. On the other hand, if I get nervous and start talking really fast, we might be out of here at 25 till 8. I'm thinking probably a lot of you wouldn't mind that a whole lot. But that doesn't mean I want you to encourage me to talk real fast. So I wanted to do a quick review just to get our minds back to where we were at the end of last week. So one of the things we haven't really talked about in a way we see in front of us is the timeline of what's happened here. And we get some of this background out of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that tell us some additional details that maybe we haven't filled in Daniel, what's recorded there. So if we go back to 605 BC, that was the time period when Nebuchadnezzar's army first took Jerusalem and Judah. And really it was Nebuchadnezzar's army putting down Egypt. Egypt had thought, we can stand up to these guys. And at the time, they were in control of Judah. And Nebuchadnezzar came down and just, kind of demonstrated to them that, no, you're really no match for Babylon. And on his way back decided, well, I'll just stop off in Judah and take care of that while I'm on the way. That was the point in time when he took away certain captives. Choice men, we're told, from among the people, and that included Daniel and some of his friends who we read about in the early chapters of Daniel's book. I think of them, we know them by their Babylonian names better, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I always think of the VeggieTales. I don't know if any of you have watched VeggieTales, but that was an excellent episode of VeggieTales. They were Rack, Shack, and Benny. Will stick with me forever. 597 BC, Daniel's already in Babylon, and actually by this time has completed his training, and we've probably seen that period of time when possibly even Daniel has come forth and interpreted that first dream of Nebuchadnezzar's. But in 597, Nebuchadnezzar's army returns and besieges Jerusalem again because they've kind of rebelled. They've gotten the impression that we can stand up to these guys. Didn't learn from Egypt, but that didn't go so well for them. And then finally in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's armies come back again to put down another uprising and essentially just destroy the place, including the temple. In 562, Nebuchadnezzar dies. And he's followed by a series of kings of Babylon, and culminating in Nabonidus in 556 BC takes the throne. He's going to stay there until 539 BC, but Nabonidus decides, scholars have different ideas about why Nabonidus isn't around. Some believe that he felt there were other things to go conquest, so he was out taking care of that. Others thought he was just an adventurer and out on adventure. And others think it's going to be related to what we hopefully get to here at the end of chapter 5, that he saw the handwriting on the wall, so to speak, how fitting for what our study will be tonight. And he was getting out of Dodge before things went bad. So he leaves his son, Belshazzar in charge. In 539 BC, the Medes under King Cyrus capture Babylon. Darius, who himself is a Mede, is placed in charge, and he's who we come to know as King Darius. He's really not the king of the Median Empire. Cyrus is that person, but Darius is the person he leaves to be in charge of what was known as Babylon. 538 BC, that's when Cyrus will decree that the Jews may return to Judah and Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. And then some scholars suggest that Daniel died around 536 BC. There is nothing to truly support that. We don't have in Scripture where we're told when Daniel died specifically. Scholars gather this from rabbinical traditions and so forth as to when Daniel died. That would place it in the 3rd year of Darius's rule. But the good thing is he got to live to see the fulfillment of some of the prophecies he made himself about the 70 years they would be in exile and get to return. So it's at least satisfying for Daniel to have gotten to see the fulfillment of that promise. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar had related that second vision, and Daniel interpreted it. Remember the one of the giant tree that provided refuge for so many things, and it came down. The idea was that Nebuchadnezzar had become pretty full of himself and he needed to be humbled. And since that wasn't happening on Nebuchadnezzar's own, God was going to make it happen. From the close of chapter 4 to the start of chapter 5, several years have passed. Not a whole lot, but several years. Babylon has seen a succession of kings following Nebuchadnezzar's death. The actual current king is Nabonidus, who is out of the country, and he's left his son, Belshazzar, now ruling while he's out of the country. We read last week about Belshazzar holding a great feast. He's entertaining the people that he not only wants to impress them with his great wealth and power, but he also wants them to know exactly who's in charge. I'm throwing this great feast. I'm in charge. You're my guest. Don't forget that. The guest list includes nobles. I find it interesting that given Daniel's stature and position under Nebuchadnezzar, he's not even considered one of these nobles to have been invited. Perhaps he was invited, and being Daniel, he just turned it down because it was not the kind of thing he wanted to be involved in. But I think they'd have told us, that had been written in there if that was the case, that he invited me, but I turned it down. Didn't want to be part of that crowd. The real problems here begin when he decides that he and his guests should use those holy items that were taken from the temple at Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar captured it so many years ago, brought it back to the stores in Babylon. To Nebuchadnezzar's credit, he never defiled those things. Granted, he took them. Not the right thing to do, but not an unusual thing in that time. When you conquered another country, you took their spoils. You took the best things they had. That was the purpose. So he took those things, but at least he did not disrespect them. He put them away. Here we see Belshazzar saying, well, let's use them for drinking cups. These are really nice. We're really great people. We're important people. We should have nice things. Bring them on out. That's what we're going to use to drink from. When we think about the messages that God delivered to Nebuchadnezzar, he used dreams. Twice Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that are recorded for us. Nothing says those were the only two, but those were the two Daniel recorded for us about very important things. And he expressed that to Nebuchadnezzar in his dreams. Nebuchadnezzar did not necessarily understand them himself, but he was able to have those dreams explained to him and get the message. It's going to take a very different and startling approach when it comes to Belshazzar. Do you remember what he observed during the feast, a hand appears out of nowhere. Not connected to anything, just a hand. Now, my first thought would be that there's been too much drinking going on and he's imagining this, but that's not the case. This is a miraculous vision and message from God. We're told that Belshazzar is frightened by the message. If we go back to verse 6 from chapter 5, it says, "The king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together." Have you ever been that scared that your limbs gave way and your knees knocked together? As I thought about this, I couldn't think of a time as an adult when I was that scared. There have been times I've been worried, maybe a little frightened, but I can't remember a time as an adult that I was so scared my knees knocked. On the other hand, I can remember plenty of times as a kid when I was scared enough that my knees knocked. Usually when I'd done something I wasn't supposed to, and I was sitting in my room waiting for my dad to get home from work and imagining all the terrible things that would happen when he did. None of them ever actually came true, but as a kid I sat there and imagined all those terrible things that were probably going to happen as a result of my misbehavior. And I guarantee you there were times my knees knocked as a kid. So I find it particularly interesting then, with the very thing that God does, reduces this mighty king, Belshazzar, to the level of a child who's so frightened. So like any good king, Belshazzar calls in the experts. We know a lot about experts today, don't we? We see them on the news multiple times every day. No two experts seem to have the same opinion about anything, but they're all experts. So Belshazzar calls in his experts. They're referred to as conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. And he promises them this great reward if they could be the one who could read this message and explain it to him. Does anybody remember what the reward was that was promised? It was a purple robe. That robe signified royalty. I think Roger talked about it last week, that not just anybody could afford something that was made that was purple. Okay, that was pretty pricey. So they were going to get a purple robe that indicated royalty. They were going to get a gold chain around their neck. And they were going to be the third ruler in the nation. But does anybody step up and claim the prize? None of his experts can do it. Now the question is, could they really not do it, or did they not want to do it? The Queen Mother reminds him that there is somebody who's pretty good at this kind of stuff. He's been around a really long time, and he seems to be able to solve things that nobody else seems to be able to solve. He's a good puzzle worker. And she tells him about Daniel. So as the events of chapter 5 unfold, it's been 66 years since Daniel was first taken from Judah. If we work from our expectation that Daniel was in his mid to late teens when this happened, that will put him in his early to mid-80s at this point in his life. It would seem that the kings who had followed after Nebuchadnezzar didn't have nearly as much value for Daniel as Nebuchadnezzar had. He's become pushed off to the side, so much so that Belshazzar really doesn't even know who he is or what he's done in the past. Fortunately, there's someone around who remembers Daniel and reminds him who he was and what he was able to do. Daniel himself was content to focus on just being a faithful servant of God at this point in his life. Through the dream of chapter 2 and the interpretation that Daniel was able to provide thanks to God's explanation to him, He was fully aware that this Babylonian empire, like all earthly empires, was only temporary. It wasn't going to last forever. Something else was coming. Remember, that chest of silver was yet to come. So let's pick up then in verse 13. Everything I have on the screen will be from the English Standard Version, unless I specifically say it's something else. So I've been trying to work from the ESV so we can be consistent. I know that's what Roger likes to work from. I do like the ESV. There's a lot of times it's much easier to read and understand than some of the other translations. I also read the New American Standard quite often. I do read the King James. On occasion, I'll look at the New International Version, but I tend to not use it so much. They tend to take a lot more liberalities with the wording. But that's a good practice to get into as you're preparing for these studies. Read multiple translations. Sometimes the way a translation words a verse may strike you a whole lot differently than other translations and make it easier to understand. So let's look at 13 and 14. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you." And I found it interesting that the King James and the New American Standard both worded it slightly differently. So whereas the ESV says that the king said, "You are that Daniel," in the other translations it says, "Are you that Daniel?" We're just changing the order of words, but it gives a very different meaning, doesn't it? In the King James and New American Standard versions, it presents Belshazzar's statement in a very different tone as a question. It's wanting to make sure that he's talking to the correct person. Now, that doesn't surprise me if we look at it that way. He didn't even know about Daniel until the Queen Mother told him. So wouldn't you want to make sure that you're talking to the right Daniel when somebody's brought before you? If we look at the ESV, that may be very true as well. That may be the right tone, where he's giving the attitude of, as Daniel's before him, "Well, I'm not going to show him I don't know who he is. I know you're that Daniel," right? We don't know, but it's interesting to consider which interpretation maybe is more reflective of the attitude of Belshazzar at the time. In verse 14, he talks of that he has heard that he has a spirit of the gods in him. Belshazzar makes it clear that Daniel's been brought before him because he's been told, in this case by the Queen Mother, that Daniel has some abilities that nobody else seems to have. Now, I don't know, Michael, if you run into this at work because, your job is being a professor. But when you work like I do in a place that maybe you have to wear several different hats, one minute I'm the IT person and the next minute I'm the safety person, right? Completely unrelated fields. But it's handy when you have a talent that maybe nobody else has. Maybe when it comes down to who stays and who goes, that talent you had is what keeps you around someday. In Daniel's case, it certainly kept him around. He's got a talent that nobody else has. And it makes him very unique and very valuable. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation. But they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So he's basically saying, I've asked all my experts. You know, Mr. Fauci had an opportunity. He didn't give me anything. Now, maybe those experts couldn't read the language. We're not told what it's written in. Maybe it was a language they had never learned. So we wouldn't expect them to be able to read it. Maybe it was a language that they could understand, but wasn't written in a way that was easy for them to understand. Or perhaps they just didn't understand the meaning of the words. Aubrey, the little girl Bonetta watches, can occasionally pick out letters for you, but that doesn't mean she can read the words when you put them together as letters, right? They're just individual letters. They don't mean anything together. Could be as simple as that. That problem's not unique to the 6th century BC. Even today, we have so-called experts who often don't know what the answer is. At least I give these experts some credit. They came up and said, don't know. They didn't bluff their way through or give explanations that really weren't accurate. They simply said, just don't know. Sometimes it's better to say, I don't know, than to give a false answer. Well, it's always better to say, I don't know, than to give a false answer, isn't it? As we look at verse 16, Belshazzar makes Daniel the same offer that he made to the experts previously. He's going to reward him with lavish gifts and with great power if he can interpret the message. It's going to make him the third ruler of the kingdom. Now, Roger kind of touched on this last week, and sometimes the things I hear and what my mind turns it into are not the same thing that your mind turns it into when you hear it. So I could very easily have misunderstood what Roger said. But I got the impression he was suggesting that the kingdom would be divided into 3 pieces. But I got a very different interpretation reading some of the other commentaries. One of them that just resonated with me, doesn't make it right, just that it resonated with me, was that Daniel would be that third person in the chain of hierarchy, right? And you say, well, why would he make him third? Well, Belshazzar wasn't really first, was he? Nabonidus was first. Belshazzar was already second. So it couldn't make him second. That'd be replacing himself. It's not going to do that. So he says, I'll make you third. You can be the third most powerful man around, right? And there's precedent for this. What did Pharaoh do when Joseph interpreted the dream of that he had? He made him the second most powerful person in all of Egypt. Not ahead of himself, but the very next person. And this is the same kind of thing that Belshazzar is promising, is that you'll be in the pecking order right after me. All right. And Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Here's Daniel being the Daniel we know from the book, is it not? He's not interested in the gifts or the power. If you studied in advance, or if you have studied in advance and read this before tonight, you probably know the reason he's not terribly worried about this gift or this power. We're going to find out in verse 30. I'm not big on giving out spoilers, so I'm not going to tell you why just yet. Compare Daniel's attitude and response, again, knowing that he's about to give Belshazzar bad news, to when he had to give Nebuchadnezzar bad news in chapter 4 about the fact that God was going to humble him. In talking to Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel was alarmed when telling him of the ordeal that he was about to endure, as God would teach him humility. He was worried for 2 reasons. One, how would Nebuchadnezzar react? He might get furious and have Daniel killed. That'd make you a little nervous. Secondly, though, it seems like he actually has some genuine concern for Nebuchadnezzar. He seemed a little, sympathetic to him that he was going to have to go through this terrible ordeal. Here, when it comes to Belshazzar, we see no such sympathy, do we? There's no hint of it here. Daniel needs to break the bad news to him, but he's not too broken up about it, is he? It would seem Daniel is not all that impressed with this new king, Belshazzar. Daniel's going to answer. O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. Daniel starts with a little history lesson in his response. Nebuchadnezzar became king not because Nebuchadnezzar was a great and powerful man, but because it was God's will and it was God's plan. God gave him the kingship of an incredible empire by the standards of that day. He had great power and great respect from those around him. Now, I won't go so far as to say he had great love from those around him. He was feared, not loved, but he certainly had respect, the kind of respect you had of that teacher who was the one who got to do the paddling when it was needed, right? You didn't love that teacher, but you certainly respected them. He refers to him as your father, and critics use this as one of the things they throw up and say, well, see, here's the error in the book. Nebuchadnezzar wasn't his father. We know that. Nabonidus is his father, is he not? But he's not speaking here literally. There's no indication even that there was a family tie back to this Nebuchadnezzar. If we look at the succession of kings after Nebuchadnezzar, it went to his son, who then went to a brother-in-law, who went to another person, and then Nabonidus isn't even tied to the family, and he leads a group that kills that king so that he becomes king. But Nebuchadnezzar is the father in the sense that he is one who has preceded him in this same office. We just see this similar concept expressed throughout Judaism when they refer to they have one father, Abraham. Well, obviously, Abraham was not their physical father, but he is somebody who preceded them and that they seek to be like. In verse 19, because of this great power that God had given to Nebuchadnezzar, the known world did not dare to oppose him. He could put to death anyone he wanted. He could spare anyone he wanted. There were certainly laws within the Babylonian Empire that said if you did a certain thing, you were expected to be put to death. Nebuchadnezzar could say, no, we're going to let him go. On the other hand, he could see somebody walking down the street who did nothing and say, I just feel like that person needs to die today. And that happened. He had that kind of power. Those who rose and fell in authority within the kingdom was entirely at the will of Nebuchadnezzar. If he didn't like you, you weren't going up. If he did like you, whether you deserved it or not, you probably were going up. But when his heart, this being Nebuchadnezzar, was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. Nebuchadnezzar was a prime example of the adage, absolute power corrupts absolutely. His unlimited power led him to believe that he was the source of his own power. He fed off of his own power. He'd failed to acknowledge that what he had was an act of God, was God's choice, God's plan to be carried out. And that God had supreme authority and ultimate control. Think back to what he said in chapter 4, verse 30, just before God's sentence upon him was carried out. It says, "And the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" Is there any good sentence that has that many I's, my's, or me's in it? That's usually a pretty bad sign, isn't it? And that was full of them, and he was full of himself. So God humbled Nebuchadnezzar by carrying out what he had revealed to him through the dream and what Daniel had interpreted for him. He was driven out from among people. He was forced to live like a wild animal. He ate grass. I know there are vegetarians and vegans today, but I don't know too many of them who go out and eat grass. He had no one around him, no companionship, and guess what? Nobody was respecting him anymore. Nobody was glorifying him anymore. No one was telling him how great he was or how great of an empire he'd built anymore. There was no one there to fill his head with self-importance. And a good thing happened. To Nebuchadnezzar's credit, the discipline that God had inflicted upon him had the desired effect. He realized his standing at last relative to God. Daniel 4:37 tells us, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble." Nebuchadnezzar speaking from personal experience, isn't he? So Daniel turns from the history lesson to its application. Is that how it works in the classroom, Michael? You explain history and then you show them how it applies today. I don't know. So he talks to Belshazzar and he says, "And you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you had lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, of iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored." Again, Belshazzar did not appreciate the complete authority of God. Same problem Nebuchadnezzar had, right? Belshazzar is just repeating that problem. The power he had made him full of himself. In verse 23, he tells him, "Here's the way you have exemplified that. You've made this very obvious, and here's how." He defiled the instruments of worship to God by not only using them for common purposes, that would have been bad enough on its own to have used them as drinking glasses, but for then turning around and praising false gods. Daniel tells him that God is responsible for the very breath he takes and his very existence. But Belshazzar has not honored God by even acknowledging him. There's an application we can take from that today. Consider that if God here holds Belshazzar accountable, given the small exposure that he had to the truth about God, so he was not a Jew, he hadn't had the benefits of the prophets of the law, so he really didn't know a whole lot about the true God, the true and living God, but God holds him accountable regardless, doesn't he? So if that's the case, how can man today expect to not be held accountable when we have the complete instruction available to us? That's God's word, recorded in the Bible. And then as Christians, do you think there's any excuse we can offer at the day of judgment if we fail to share that word with other people? Our goal should always be help them to get out of their ignorance, right? We can't necessarily expect people to understand and follow God if they're ignorant of him, his will for us, and his plan for us. So we can't really make an excuse in that day why we didn't share it with others, why we just kept it to ourselves. So continuing, Daniel explains, then from his presence, that being the presence of God, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. I have no idea if I pronounced that right, but neither do you, so we're all okay. I tell my students, in the high school class, junior high classes, when they're reading scripture out of the book and they come across a name like Belshazzar, you say it however you want. There's nobody in this room can tell you that that isn't right. None of us were there. You're as right as any of us can come up with. The wording is just, the last word is spelled a little differently in the New American and the King James. Instead of parsin, it's ufarsin. U means and. The U means and farson is an alternate spelling of parson. And I think Roger touched on the fact that when it comes to reading these old manuscripts, the challenges are, there are no breaks in the words. There are no vowels, so it's all consonants. You've got to figure out what vowels fill in based on the context of what you're seeing before you. So it's easy to come up with different spellings here. So in verse 24, Daniel explains that God has held Belshazzar accountable, and he's informed you of what his judgment is by this most unusual of means, this hand writing on the wall. So Daniel has fulfilled the first part. He's read the inscription for Belshazzar. There were two things Belshazzar asked, right? Tell me what it says and tell me what it means. So just like I said about Aubrey, somebody else might have been able to tell him the letters, but they not have been able to tell him what the words were that it made or what the meaning of those words were. Daniel can obviously do both. Is that because Daniel is so special? It's because God has given him the ability to do this for a purpose. So Daniel tells him that this is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, the first word. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Now, if you were paying attention on the last slide, you're saying, where did Perez come from? That was Parshin, wasn't it? Parshin is plural. Perez is the singular version of Parshin. What can I tell you? It's Aramaic. I don't understand it either. So Mene is repeated, so it's Mene, Mene. and that means to count or number. So does repeating mean possibly that he counted more than once, that God counted everything up and then counted it all up again, just to give Belshazzar the benefit of the doubt? I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Don't want to not give him credit. Kelly, do you ever do that with your students with tests? Go back over, maybe they got something right that I marked wrong, right? Of course, God is always right, so he was right the first time. The result is the days of the Babylonian Empire are at an end. The dream that God had given to Nebuchadnezzar foretold of this, and Daniel interpreted it that way to him. We're simply seeing the fulfillment of that prophecy that God gave through Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Tekel means to weigh. In modern society, we refer to the concept of the scales of justice. Right? We've got to balance things out. There are different factors involved. It's not always clear-cut. We've got to weigh the consequences both ways and find a fair and equitable solution for everyone. God has weighed Belshazzar here in the scales of life. And in effect, by weighing Belshazzar, he's weighed the Babylonian Empire. And he's found them lacking. They didn't make the weight. They're unworthy of continuation. I didn't know about this when I wrote this comment, but we happened to be in a meeting today, and a gentleman was talking about his nephew. And his nephew is over at WVU, part of the football program. Apparently a pretty good-sized young man, strong. 275, I believe he told me. And they're working with him on the offensive line, and they tell him he's doing a great job. He just needs to put on 35 more pounds. He won't be a starter until he puts on another 35. Wow. That's kind of scary to me. But kind of gives us the concept here. He got weighed, and he came in too low. He's not going to be a starter. He's getting benched. And then we get to Perez. Perez, again, is that singular form of parson or upharshin from verse 25, and it means divide. The kingdom has now been separated from Babylon. This empire is no longer under the control of Babylon. A new era is about to begin, and it will be under the Medes and Persians. And this is all consistent with the vision that was foretold in chapter 2. We're going to just get it in. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Belshazzar followed through on his promise. Daniel was given the purple robe, and the chain was placed upon Daniel's neck, and a decree was made that Daniel was the third highest ruler in the land. We're not really told of Belshazzar's reaction to what he's been told. Was his response the result of his belief in what Daniel had told him and his resignation to the fact of this is what's going to happen, like it or not? Or did he simply dismiss what Daniel had to say, but he'd made the promise that if you tell me what this says and what it means, I'll do these things for you, so he was bound to do it. Remember, Belshazzar never said in his promise to his experts that you had to tell me something I liked. You just have to tell me what it says and what it means. And we're told that very night Belshazzar was killed. Daniel's status as the third highest authority in the land didn't last very long, did it? Less than a day. That very night, the capital city, which had been under siege by the Medes for quite some time, fell. The Babylonians were not concerned about the siege. It had been going on for some time. Roger talked about the fact in the last couple of weeks that they had 20 years' worth of food. They had a river that ran right through the city, so they had all the fresh water that they needed. They had 2 walls. That was unheard of. No enemy was going to get through 1 wall, let alone 2. In reality, when it all happened, and Roger touched on this previously, the Medes diverted the river that flowed into the city, and they walked right in on the riverbed underneath the opening in the wall for the river. And guess what? The Babylonians were completely unprepared. They never thought anybody'd get inside their walls. They had no expectation, and they were completely unprepared, and actually the city fell very quickly with very little bloodshed. And the Medes, who won the day, wasted no time in doing away with Belshazzar. And we're told that Darius the Mede received the kingdom. Again, understanding that he is not the king of the Mede Empire. Cyrus is, but he's placed in control of Babylon. He's installed as the new ruler or magistrate or king, whatever word you like. But he's going to carry out the will of Cyrus. Whatever Cyrus wants done is what's going to be done. It's a similar concept we're going to see repeated when it comes to the Roman Empire. You have Caesar. Caesar dictates everything, right? But you have governors that he puts in charge of things. Caesar can't be everywhere. He needs somebody out there close to what's going on to keep track of things. That's what Darius is to Cyrus. So that actually wraps up Chapter 5. I'd actually prepared slides for 6 in case we got that far. I was really hoping not to, and we didn't, so that's a good thing. I will tell you that the main themes of Chapter 6, so read ahead so that you're prepared for this fall when we pick it back up. The cream rises to the top. Jealousy is a powerful tool of Satan. The world prefers to pull others down rather than lift themselves up. Bureaucrats and career politicians. Something to be worried about. Read the fine print, and trust in God is never misplaced. So with that, Tom's going to take my place and do announcements.